Thanks for watching my video presentation. I recorded this ahead of time because my wife is about to go in labor and I don't know what life's going to look like in the next month. So my plan is to present in class, but if something happens and I'm not able to do that, this presentation is a backup. So I'll be talking about Penderecki's Capriccio for solo tuba. Now I'm going to share my screen. So I want you to imagine a piece of music with no meter. How many different ways would there be to approach this piece of music? How would you approach phrasing? How might you approach breathing? Meter and bar lines affect the way we play a piece of music. So Penderecki's Capriccio for solo tuba is unique in several different ways. Firstly, it's unique in its Penderecki's only work for solo tuba. It's also one of the most difficult pieces that was written during its time, the 1980s. This was an unprecedented level of difficulty in the tuba repertoire. It was also written without meter, so the entire work is in one measure. In this presentation, I'll discuss this work, compare 6 different recordings by notable professionals, and I'll also discuss an article in which Penderecki explains his interpretation for his own work. Krzysztof Penderecki was a Polish composer that lived from 1933 until 2020. Penderecki first rose to prominence for his explorations of novel string textures. For many years, he was known as an avant-garde Polish composer. Penderecki has produced a substantial body of work which challenges many assumptions about the nature and purpose of contemporary music. In the words of the Grove article, Penderecki's Capriccio was commissioned in 1980 by the Warsaw Symphony Orchestra for a celebration. Penderecki explained that time got away from him and the deadline was very soon. From writing the first 5 notes to the completion of the piece took him only 2 to 3 hours. The work was premiered by Warsaw Symphony's tuba player just a few days later. And some have said that although the work took 2 or 3 hours to compose, it takes months to master, and that's accurate. Because this presentation has a 20 to 22 minute time limit, my scope will only be the first half of Capriccio, which is the first 2 of the 4 total pages. 6 recordings that I have compared are David Zirkel from 2008. David Zirkel was the tuba professor at the University of Georgia at that time, but now he teaches at the University of Michigan. Kent Eshelman from 2012, who is and was teaching at Baylor. Benjamin Pierce, who's the teacher at University of Arkansas in Fayetteville. This recording is from 2015. Tom Lukowicz, who is at Kent State. The recording's from 2017. Alan Baer, 2018. This was a master class, and Baer is the principal tuba in the New York Phil. And Sergio Carolino, who is a professional tubist in Portugal. This was an informal recording done in 2019 to show his students his concept of the first 2 pages. So the 6 areas of interpretation I'll focus on with respect to the 6 recordings are the general style, the choice of tempo, how the performer interprets the triplets, how the performer navigates the breath marks throughout, how the performer manipulates the tempo in the 5th and 6th lines, and the interpretation of the up and down arrows at the end of the 2nd page. So to see specific similarities and differences among the different recordings that I've notated, you can refer to the handout. Next, I will discuss glaring contrasts and similarities between the performance in relation to Penderecki's own words about the piece, which I gather from an article by Rubelski in 2000 in which he interviewed Penderecki about this piece. So in these recordings regarding style, contrast was the primary guiding principle. The amount of contrast, however, varied. Dave Zirkle and Kent Eshelman had a great amount of contrast, where Tom Lukowicz was on the lighter side throughout, and Sergio Carolino, his style was much heavier. The tempo also varied greatly from performer to performer. So now I will show you two of the fastest and slowest recordings. The first is Sergio Carolino, who starts about quarter note equals 170. Now the slowest recording starts about quarter note equals 108. And as you can see, there was a gradual accelerando through that recording, which continues for a few more measures. But you can see in these two extreme examples how fast and slow the tempo is interpreted. There's no written quarter note equals or any of that stuff. The tempo at the beginning is tempo alla polacca. All right. So the Kent Eshelman, as you see here, began around quarter equals 108. Sergio Carolino plays around quarter equals 172. There is a great variety in each performance regarding the tempo. However, Tom Lukowicz's tempo was the most consistent. He kept the quarter note around 132 for the entire performance. In Wroblewski's article, Wroblewski explains that Penderecki prefers that there should be a variety of tempi throughout the piece, but the first tempo, marked scherzo alla polacca, should not be played too fast. His preferred tempo is quarter equals 120 to 124 and should remain steady until the rallentando at the bottom of the second page. So a lot of performers like to interpret this with a lot of rubato that I don't know how Penderecki would agree or disagree with that. But his preference obviously is more steady of a tempo. Regarding the triplets, it seems that, as I previously mentioned, plenty or rubato is the common interpretation. This varies from starting slowly and getting faster through the triplets, or starting fast and slowing down. However, Ben Pierce his interpretation of the triplets is the most intentional sounding. It sounds like a dancer, which this piece is meant to suggest or evoke a Polish dance. Pierce's interpretation of these triplets sound kind of like a dancer stumbling. All right, I'll now play Ben Pierce's interpretation of the triplets. All right. Lukowicz's tempo is the most consistent during the triplets, so he keeps the tempo pretty steady instead of the rubato, which is the normal. And as I mentioned earlier, Penderecki's preference seemed to be that the tempo would be consistent. So the rubato is like a stylistic interpretation that seems kind of opposite of the composer's intentions. All right, so there are several breath marks on the first page. There aren't many on the second, but on the first page there are several breath marks. And the interpretation of those breath marks seems open to the performer based on the article by Wroblewski. But each performer kind of treated all of them differently except for two of the breath marks. Most of the other breath marks were treated as musical commas, so they would just be quick, seamless breath marks. However, the general consensus was to breathe after this breath mark shown on line 5, which is the top line on this slide, as the end of a section, a transitional breath mark. Also, it was common among all the recordings to not observe the breath mark in the sixth line. Just completely pretend it wasn't there and treat that as one phrase. All right. Regarding breath marks, Wroblewski explains that you will notice that there are several breath marks or commas throughout the composition. They are not to be interpreted as pauses or slight lifts. They are what they appear to be, places to breathe. As with any ideas regarding interpretation, these are just that, ideas that happen to come from the composer of the work. One doesn't have to follow them to the letter. So Wroblewski, in his interview with Penderecki, was speaking specifically about breath marks, but perhaps regarding interpretation, some of the performers might be knowledgeable of this and apply it to rubato, but speaking specifically, Wroblewski was speaking specifically about breath marks here. All right, now I will play David Zirkel's interpretation, and which was common amongst all of the performers, of the breath mark in the fifth line and the lack of breath mark in the sixth line. All right. It seemed like there might have been a small breath mark, a small breath, but it was very seamless, whereas some of the other recordings just didn't observe it at all. Treatment of tempo in lines 5 and 6 was very different in each recording. In half of them, the tubas maintained a steady tempo. In the other half, the tempo was much slower at the beginning, followed by an accelerando until the 3 repeating D flats. All right. The arrows at the end of the second page, which is on the screen now, and how the final arrow transitions to the third page are interpreted very similarly. The notes in most of the recordings are interpreted as chromatically ascending extremely high and low notes. Most of the recordings begin ascending and ascending on the double arrows. So the first 4 arrows, they'll play the same high, same low note, and they'll start ascending chromatically on the double arrow up. And then the next down arrow, they descend chromatically down. Only one recording interprets the arrows as the same high and low notes. Additionally, only one recording does not lead from the glissando at the end of the page into the figure that begins the third page. These are both these interpretations that one of the 6 do seem to align more with the composer's intent. For example, as I'll mention later, the composer wanted the up and down arrows to be the highest and lowest possible notes that you can make sound good. He also intentionally put this glissando fermata at the end of the second page so that the performer would have to turn to the third page, and a lot of people make a copy of the third page to lead into it. So let's look at a couple different interpretations. The first is Lukowicz. I believe Lukowicz is an example of one of the performers that ascend and descend and then lead into the third page. Right, so he didn't even wait until the double arrow to ascend. Each arrow in either direction was interpreted as chromatic steps. The next is Kent Eshelman, and he interprets the arrows as the same note up and down. And clearly you can hear how he glissandoed into the third page. And it did seem like he moved chromatically down on the down arrows. But all of the previous arrows were the same pitch and the up arrows were all the same. And it was more of an effect than a specific pitch, because the tone was not as clear as, for example, Lukowicz. I'd like to discuss specifically some of Penderecki's preferences from Robleski's article. And some of these preferences seem very opposite to some of the performances which I've analyzed, which is interesting because all of the performances came after this article. So all of the performers had access to this article published by the International Tuba and Euphonium Association, which is the main association which all of these professionals are a part of. So some of Penderecki's preferences from the Robleski's article include: don't begin the piece too fast. It is important to the piece that it starts off a little less and then really save it and go for it at the end. These are Robleski's words. Each time the cell consisting of a slurred descending minor third occurs, there should be a slight weight given to the upper note, especially when these notes are not printed with accents. Think of them as quasi-accented. Dee-dum, dee-dum. The arrowed notes in the last system of page 2, according to the composer, should not be played as random high and low notes. Rather, they should be played as the best possible high and low notes that the player can produce. It should be thought of as if it were written for a string player. For them, yes, there are limits to highs and lows. When they perform those notes in similar circumstances, they play their best sounding high and low notes. That is what we need to do also. So there's no mention of chromatic ascent or descent in Penderecki's preference. I don't know the source of that interpretation. Although it could be the earliest recording I found, I'm not exactly sure, but I've been instructed to play that several times. Again, in the last system, on page 2, the last note has a fermata on it and a glissando tagged to it. This should be played as written. In other words, one should not copy the last 2 pages to alleviate the page turn, because that slight pause was intended by the composer. And I believe the only recording that did not glissando from the second to the third page is David Zirkel, which also was the earliest recording. So I've been told by several teachers to glissando from the second to the third page, but I don't plan on doing that anymore because of this article that I found. I think it's important, as we've talked about in this class, to stay true to the composer's wishes. And if I'm going to make a decision that is not what the composer intended, I would need to be very intentional about that decision. And I don't see where that's the case in this situation. So to conclude, it's interesting how contrasting the 6 recordings are from each other and from Penderecki's own thoughts about the piece, especially since the article was published before all of these recordings. So my performance of the first 2 pages of the work will demonstrate some of the common interpretations from these recordings with Penderecki's own thoughts about his work. Please enjoy the first half of Penderecki's Capriccio for solo tuba.